Jonas and Alicia for all of the organization that went into today's panel. So I'm delighted to welcome everyone to the 5th event in the Toward Transformative Justice Community Roundtable series on race, racism, and policing that the Northwestern Prison Education Program is hosting. So the Northwestern Prison Education Program provides a degree-granting comprehensive liberal arts education to people who are incarcerated in Illinois. As our nation reckons with the systemic racism of America's criminal justice system and its pernicious investment in policing, criminalization, and incarceration, this roundtable series aims to open space for conversation on these urgent topics and to bridge research, legal work, policy, and community activism in addressing them. The roundtable discussions have been held twice per month throughout the summer. This is our 5th of 6th. So we hope you'll join us for our last one, which will be 2 weeks from today. So thank you and welcome again. And I will turn it over to Alicia, who will be doing the introductions and the moderating.
Hello, everyone. As Jennifer already said, this is our 5th panel. And I am extremely excited, both personally and because of my research in immigration. For today's panel, we have 2 very distinguished speakers. And I just wanted to start before introducing them just by saying that our students in NPEP are incarcerated peoples and they can't join us today. So I wanted to have that in mind. And especially with this panel today, both Susan and Nicole work with detained migrants. So we wanted to just have that in mind that they can't join us. And we would love for in the future if we could be able to have these voices in panels like these. So now I'm going to introduce Nicole Hallett. She is an associate clinical professor of law at the University of Chicago and directs the Immigrants' Rights Clinic, which provides legal representation to immigrant communities in Chicago, including individual representation of immigrants in removal proceedings, immigration-related complex federal litigation, and policy and community education projects on behalf of community-based organizations. Her scholarship focuses on immigration and labor employment law, and in particular, how laws in these areas either promote or impede collective action and power building in subordinated communities. In her practice, she specializes in creative lawyering through complex litigation and multi-pronged advocacy. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, NPR, The Nation, The Today Show, The Intercept, and the Associated Press. Please help me welcome Dr. Nicole Hallet.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here. Okay, so you know, this is an interesting topic that we're addressing today because you know, usually when you think about racism and policing, you think about the criminal justice system. I think that's where most people start anyway. And you know, if you've been paying attention over the last few years, you know that there are lots of issues at every single step of the criminal justice system. We've been hearing a lot about, you know, the front end where people encounter the criminal justice system for the first time, or for, you know, how they enter the system, which is through encounters with police officers. That's been sort of front of mind recently, but has really taken the foreground in the national conversation over the last few years. And then, you know, as people work their way through the criminal justice system at every single stage, there are racist laws and there is racism that affects the decision making at each stage. And so, you know, you think about, you know, mandatory minimums for drug crimes, and the fact that for many years and still today in some cases, there are harsher penalties inflicted against drug offenders who are, you know, caught with drugs that are more often used by minority communities. So there's racism built into the actual laws and the sentences that people are subjected to. And then of course we have the whole prison system, which, you know, we could have an entire discussion about that. And I believe that this roundtable probably has addressed that issue elsewhere. So you know, in some ways, I think people think of the immigration system as being kind of different and separate. And it also has been a topic that has received a lot of attention recently, specifically since the election of Donald Trump, because he made that one of the centerpieces of his presidential campaign. And since he's been the president, this administration has taken many, what I would consider to be anti-immigrant actions and policies, which have made the news, and we're all sort of familiar with them. And if you don't know kind of how the systems work, you might think that what's happening in the immigration system and what's happening in the criminal justice system are sort of two different problems, right? But the more you kind of get into that system, what you realize is that the immigration system over many years has become a part of the criminal justice system, and they're inextricably linked, and you really can't think about one without the other. So what I'd like to do right now is just talk a little bit about the connections between those two systems and how racism and other biases that exist in one actually exacerbate the problems in both systems. So I think the most obvious example of this is that so for individuals who are disproportionately affected by the criminal justice system, so Black and brown people, once you have a conviction on your record, if you are a non-citizen, that then puts you into the immigration system as well. So our immigration law is very complex, and many people can be deported for many different reasons. I saw a study recently that estimated that something like 60% of the non-citizens in this country could be deported for some reason, right? The grounds of inadmissibility are so broad that if the government wants to find a reason to deport a non-citizen, they will probably be able to find it in the majority of cases. But one of the ways in which the immigration system deports people is by deporting them based on criminal convictions, okay? So if you think about someone who's working their way through the system, a non-citizen, because the immigration system for the most part only affects non-citizens, what you have is a system that disproportionately affects immigrants of color for the same reasons that all people of color are disproportionately affected. And then they are then subject to a second system, the immigration system, which is further penalizes them for the same conduct which got them into the criminal justice system in the first place. And so in some ways, it amplifies the effects of the racism in the criminal justice system. So to give you an example, someone is pulled over and they find drugs in your pocket. You're arrested, you're charged with some sort of drug offense. Now, there might be all sorts of reasons why that person was stopped, why that person was targeted. The prosecutor might ask for a longer sentence, based on certain characteristics that people have. And all of that is true for everyone, whether you're a citizen or a non-citizen. But then if you're a non-citizen, there's an additional layer of penalty, which is that as soon as you are convicted and serve your sentence, you go directly into the immigration system. And sometimes the penalties, and I use the word penalty intentionally, even though that's not what people say is happening. They say it's an administrative procedure, but it's a penalty to get deported. I don't think we should pretend that this is some sort of administrative process. This is people who many times have lived here for decades. They belong here. They're part of this community. And because of relatively minor crimes, they can be deported, which is a kind of banishment. It's a kind of, and sometimes a permanent kind of banishment. And so the same kinds of factors that get people into the criminal justice system then subject them to another layer of penalty after they've worked their way through the criminal justice system, which is oftentimes even more oppressive and is a harsher penalty than the criminal justice system could even impose, all right? And so if you are a non-citizen, you can't really separate the criminal justice system from the immigration system. Those two systems are intertwined. So I know that I think Susan is going to talk about the detention system in this country and how that system operates. But again, this is a case in which there are more similarities between the immigration system and the criminal justice system than you might think just upon hearing, about these two issues. So the first thing to realize is that many people who are in immigration detention actually have never even been convicted of a crime. Right now in this country, there are tens of thousands of people who are detained, oftentimes for months or years while they litigate their immigration claims. And most of them have asylum claims and don't have a criminal record. So in some ways, what the immigration system is doing is it's criminalizing people who, in any other scenario would not be considered to have committed a crime. The second thing to think about is that while it's not criminal, it's not incarceration in the same way that, that we think about it in the prison system. For all intents and purposes, immigration detention and criminal incarceration look identical. So I go to these detention centers. They look like, first of all, many of them are jails. They're actually jails that local governments rent out to ICE to house people. But they are indistinguishable from prisons. There's solitary confinement. All of the same restrictions on people's liberty apply. They're not allowed to read certain books. They're not allowed to, it really honestly is no different than what happens to people in the criminal justice system. And so what you have is a system in which tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, if you look at over time, have been imprisoned. Most of them, or a majority of them, haven't actually committed a crime, and they're being subjected to, detention, which is indistinguishable from criminal incarceration. So, it's almost as if the criminal justice system is already so vast, and we have more people incarcerated than any other country in the world, and yet even that is not the extent of the carceral state that we live in, because we have now incarcerated tens of thousands, at a time, probably hundreds of thousands over the years, of people who are literally just coming to seek refuge in this country. So, the really frustrating thing about the immigration system is that regardless of whatever problems there are in the criminal justice system, there are certain constitutional protections which we sort of take for granted, right? So people are entitled to attorneys. If you're charged with a crime, you get an attorney. The state has to meet an extremely high burden in order to convict you, right? Beyond a reasonable doubt. That is an extremely high standard. And so on and so forth. There are a series of rights that are supposed to protect people. Now that the system doesn't always work, we know that. We know that there are many problems in the criminal justice system. But if you can, try to imagine a system in which the effect is essentially the same. You might be detained for years away from your family in prison-like conditions, but where none of those protections exist, right? So you have a system in which people aren't entitled to an attorney. Many, many immigrants go through the system without having any, legal representation at all. The standard that the government has to meet in order to keep you detained is fairly low. And furthermore, the person deciding whether you have to be detained is an immigration judge, which, despite the fact that it has the word judge in the title, it makes it sound like a judge, but is in fact extremely different than what we would consider to be judges in the criminal justice system. These are judges who are employees of the Department of Justice. It is not a court. It is an administrative tribunal. The judges have very little independence, and oftentimes, there isn't really a real, adversarial process. The immigration judges are there to rubber stamp what the government wants, and that's even more the case in the immigration system than it is in the criminal justice system. And so, given that kind of system, it's the kind of system which, if those of us who have the privilege of being an American citizen were subjected to it, I think it would be pretty shocking, and I think people would be really upset about it. And in fact, when you look at what's happened in Portland, where DHS agents have gone after protesters and, arrested them in unmarked cars and not told them what they're being arrested for. And there's been a lot of outrage about that. But the truth of the matter is that DHS operates like that in immigrant communities and has since it was created. And so, when I, as an immigration lawyer, I hear that ICE agents or Border Patrol agents are arresting people for no reason and putting them in vans and taking them, places and not telling them what, why they're being taken, that actually doesn't shock me at all, because that's the kind of thing that has been happening to my clients for years. So, it's actually in some ways, I think, not that it's good that obviously that we have armed vigilante government officers on streets kidnapping protesters. I'm not trying to suggest that. But as someone who's worked in this system for many years, when I have the chance to tell a larger audience about what immigrant communities have been subjected to for a long time, I take that opportunity, because I think it's quite shocking for people that are not involved in the system to understand how the system works. So just to give you an example of the kind of, sorry, hold on one second. My earbud fell out of my ear. So just to kind of give you an example of the kind of person that ends up in the immigration detention facility. Just recently, I was, right before the COVID-19 crisis hit, I was in a detention center. I was doing legal intakes, and I met this gentleman. He had been detained for 3 years. He had been trying to seek asylum. He was from India. He was Sikh. He had been beaten up several times, like close to death. He fled. He managed to get to somewhere in Central America and then crossed the southern border. And so he gave me all of his paperwork. He said he didn't have a criminal conviction. He needed to not be detained anymore. He'd been detained for 3 years. His case had just come back down from an appeal, so it was going to be months, maybe years before he got a decision. And so I was reading his paperwork, and I read the bond decision in his case that the judge had issued. And this decision basically said that he had hired someone to help him cross the border, what some people might call a coyote, right? And therefore, he had aided and abetted alien smuggling by hiring someone to smuggle himself. And therefore, he was a danger to the community and had to be locked up, throughout the duration of him litigating his asylum claim. And, even kind of took me back in sort of how preposterous that argument was, that someone who had been beaten within an inch of his life, who had spent 6 months trying to make it to the United States and who had paid someone to help him cross the border, was a danger to the community because he had somehow aided and abetted alien smuggling. But, honestly, that's the kind of thing that we see all the time. And so just one final comment, then I want to turn it over to Susan. So there's been a lot of public attention on the immigration system since Trump took office. And, he's wanted it to be that way. And most of the time when he, implements new policies that are very anti-immigrant, he does it loudly and proudly, right? So we hear about it, it's in the newspaper. And people who never really thought much about the immigration system before have begun to notice the injustices in the system. But one thing that I hope we can all think about is the fact that the immigration system did not start to develop problems when Trump took office. This is a system that has been increasingly kind of oppressive for years, and in some ways, the fact that Trump is doing it openly means that we can see what's happening, whereas previous administrations have done things sort of under the radar. And my hope, we don't know what's going to happen in November. I certainly, as an immigration lawyer, am, full disclosure, hoping there's a change, because I don't know if I can actually practice for 4 more years under this administration. But if there is a change, I think we need to be careful to not forget about everything that we've learned through the Trump administration and continue to press whatever administration there is, whether it's the Biden administration or whoever in the future, for real immigration reform. And we need to do that even if it's not on the front page, even if we have a president who says all the right things and talks about being inclusive, and surely, Democratic presidents will do that. But that doesn't really fix the problems in the system. And so for people listening who are committed to this issue, do not breathe a sigh of relief if the election comes out the way that I hope it will, and say, well, now we can go back to everything kind of being the way it was. The way things was really bad, and yes, it's gotten worse, but it's not acceptable to go back to the way things were in 2016. Obama jailed children, just like Trump is. Obama deported over 1 million people, and many of those people were not criminals, were not rapists and murderers and whoever else. They were just people who were here working and trying to support their families and contributing to our society. So we have to do better. And, obviously we have priorities now. Right now, all we're trying to do is prevent bad things, further bad things from happening. But if we get into a position where we have an administration that's open to listening, we really need to press for, systemic change that solves these problems that have existed for a very long time. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll happy to answer questions after Susan speaks.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That was amazing. And thank you so much for that reminder at the end that we need to do better. I now turn to Dr. Susan J. Terrio, who is a professor emerita of Anthropology and French Studies at Georgetown University. Her scholarly and teaching interests are wide in range, but some of them include youth and globalization, legal systems, the juvenile justice, craft and family entrepreneurship, education, class struggles, and structures, and even food and foodways. Her third book, Whose Child Am I? Undocumented, Unaccompanied Children in the U.S. Immigration Custody, was published in 2015 by the University of California Press and has been absolutely central for my own work on Central American child migrants. Dr. Terrio's most recent collaboration, Illegal Encounters, The Effect of Detention and Deportation on Young People, has and will leave a huge mark on those studying youth and its intersections with migration. In conjunction with that research, Dr. Terrio has been interviewed by the Congressional Research Service, the Houston Chronicle, LA Times, NPR, and the Washington Post, just to name a few. So please help me welcome Dr. Susan J. Terrio.
Thank you very much, Alicia, and thank you, Nicole. That was an exemplary presentation, and it really set the parameters for what we need to be thinking about in thinking about how the federal government polices immigration. So the anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies of the Trump administration, as Nicole pointed out, have very successfully criminalized the very act of seeking protection as well as the act of providing it. And so I want to take some time to delve into both the adult and juvenile immigration detention, prisons, and policies, because, as Nicole said, they work in tandem to advance the enforcement regime of this administration. So I want, and as Alicia said, I have served as a legal assistant in immigration prisons in Texas. And after leaving DC and moving to Savannah, Georgia, I've gotten involved as a volunteer doing visitations in the Georgia immigration prisons that are among the most appalling and notorious for their conditions. So I'm going to start with some questions that I want you to think about. So what do you call a system where you can be detained in prison-like conditions indefinitely while you wait for a hearing on your case and have no right to a public defender, even if you're poor? What do you call a system where there's little oversight, no meaningful grievance procedures, and serious human rights abuses of detainees? What do you call a system where basic medical care is woefully inadequate, the water is barely potable, and the food is so bad that you have to buy your own at inflation commissary prices just to stave off hunger? And what do you call a system where visitations with your family and friends are limited to 1 hour a week, and you're urged to volunteer, in quotes, for 9 hours of work that pays between 1 and 4 hours a day? Well, of course, the answer to that is you call it a private immigration prison in Georgia. And I want to just concentrate on the most notorious prison, which is the Steward Detention Center in Lumpkin, Georgia. And it's one of 4 immigration prisons in Georgia. And Steward is interesting because it was built as a minimum security prison for criminal offenders, and it stayed empty until 2006 when the federal government contracted with the for-profit prison company, Corrections Corporation of America, which has since rebranded itself as Core Civic. And the original contract was to detain 1,900 men without legal status. And as Nicole pointed out, these are men imprisoned because they're in the US without authorization, not because they've been charged with or convicted of crimes. Any non-citizen now can be detained, including asylum seekers, survivors of torture and human trafficking, parents and children, long-term residents of the US, picked up for minor violations, or in collateral raids, as well as people who cross the border without inspection. And locking up undocumented immigrants is one of the fastest growing and most profitable forms of mass incarceration. As of April 2020, there were 184 jails, and 81% of those, are run by for-profit prison companies. And immigration detention has grown 900% since 1990, from less than about 5,000 people who were detained to more than 50,000, approaching 60,000 at one point this year. Now, ICE was only created in 2003, but has since grown exponentially. And incarceration in private prisons is not a public service, it's big business. Local municipalities, of course, welcome these private prisons because they get a cut of the per diem cost that's paid by the federal government. And Lumpkin is a perfect example of this. It's located in one of the poorest counties in Georgia. It's the largest employer in the area and the single largest revenue stream to the county. The local population is a majority African-American population, and the median household income there is $25,000. The poverty rate stands at almost 38. And Steward is, of course, managed by the largest prison company in the nation, Core Civic. It owns 43 correctional facilities with 73,000 bed capacity, and its revenue in 2019 was almost $2 billion. And as Nicole pointed out, because immigration detention is considered a civil, not a penal system, detained people have very few due process rights. They have no right to government funded legal representation. They have no right to a speedy trial. They don't have any guarantee on the ban for cruel and unusual punishment. And there is no formal monitoring of prison conditions by outside independent inspectors. And although it is technically a civil system, the conditions there are often far worse than in many state and federal prisons. And the dismal record of abuses in Steward and other immigration prisons in Georgia include racist taunts and physical assaults, the infliction of solitary confinement up to 23 hours a day for very minor infractions, the denial of basic medical care as a punishment for complaining about the conditions, and these prisons offer no educational opportunities and very limited recreation. Visitations occur via telephone, behind glass partitions, and there's very little accommodation for friends and family who come. No cell phones, no drinks, no food are permitted in the waiting rooms, and families are often stuck there for hours. Even breast milk is on the no list. During my February 2020 visit, a female guard, ordered a young mother to go outside and breastfeed her baby on a day when the temperatures were 40 degrees. Now, many of the detained men in Steward have fled persecution in their home countries and now seek asylum. And I have a story of a person exactly like the one Nicole mentioned. But the problem, in addition to the severe shortage of pro bono attorneys there, is the grant rate for asylum at the Atlanta Immigration Court, which is where all of the detainees at Steward are heard. There is, in fact, a courtroom right there in the prison. And the man I visited, because I speak French fluently and they don't have very many French interpreters, was from West Africa. And like Nicole's Indian man, he was severely beaten for his political beliefs by the police. He fled, he survived a harrowing journey across South and Central America and did the right thing. He had read up, he had the equivalent of a master's degree in the French system. So he presented himself at a port of entry. And at that point was shackled and shuttled between overcrowded CBP, that is Customs and Border Protection facilities, for 3 weeks before he landed in Steward. There, he passed a credible fear interview, and he had the medical records and witness affidavits confirming his persecution, and so he was hopeful about winning asylum. Little did he realize was that the Atlanta Immigration Court grants between 2 and 3% of the petitions that are presented to them. So not surprisingly, his case was denied, and he's languished in detention for a year and a half, waiting for appeal. So in addition to asylum petitioners, many immigrants are detained after being apprehended for very minor violations, like a visa overstay, driving without a license, or even a broken taillight. And the private prison in Osceola, which has adult men and women, is operated by a different for-profit corporation, the LaSalle Corporation. And women there are often, almost all of them, victims of domestic violence in their home countries or in the United States. And all of the women we visited last fall came as children and have no contacts in their home countries. Most of them are mothers who've been separated from their minor children and too often lose track of them while they're in detention. I mean, and this is interesting because I'm going to talk a little bit about the separation of families that resulted from the zero tolerance policy that was instituted in 2018. With much fanfare, most of us thought that the separation of families had stopped or diminished. And in fact, this is another way in which families continue to be separated. One woman we met came to the US when she was 2 years old, and because she refused to give up on her fight against a removal order, she's been detained there for over 2 years. So enter the COVID virus. In response to reports that COVID was rapidly expanding in detention centers, dozens of habeas petitions were filed across the country to demand the release of elderly and medically vulnerable detainees. And ICE originally said that these fears were purely speculative and that there was no problem, there were no infections. And then when they were asked about the young mothers who are detained with their children in Dilley, Texas, where I volunteered, they said that the women were actually safer inside the prison than outside in the community. And later, when ICE could no longer deny the presence of COVID, the agency insisted it was taking necessary precautions. But back to Steward again, only 12% of the detained population has been tested, and 52% of those detainees have tested positive. And anyone who knows anything about the way prisons are organized, whether they're state or federal prisons, social distancing is absolutely not possible. There were no masks, there were inadequate supplies of soap and sanitizers. The detainees who were sick were placed with other detainees who were sick or put in solitary confinement. The request for medical attention went unanswered. And even though the overall population of people in ICE detention has decreased, Steward has continued to accept new arrivals and transfers. So I want to take just a few minutes of talking about the way that the adult and the juvenile immigration detention systems overlap and are mutually supportive of one another. Alicia mentioned the book that I wrote about children and youth in immigration custody. And this was, again, that research was done in 26 different federal facilities at all different security levels. There's low, medium, and high security levels in these federal facilities. And at the time that I was doing my research, and I had really pretty unprecedented access to these closed facilities, there were robust humanitarian protections in place. The Flores Settlement Agreement and the 2008 TVPRA had provided additional protections and established a federal set of standards for the humane treatment of kids in custody. And despite that, I was very critical of that system because of what I saw as an increasing tension between the humanitarian mandate to safely house them, to provide legal screenings and get them out of detention as quickly as possible and be reunited with qualified sponsors on the one hand, but there was an increasing emphasis on what I call security or enforcement paradigm that was very worrying because these closed facilities, although they were described by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which manages these systems as home-like environments, they are really nice looking prisons. They have, they're run on a penal or psychiatric model with monitored entry and exit and movement when inside. Any kid who attempts to escape or even threatens to escape faces serious consequences. And there's no set end point to these periods of detention, although they historically have tended to be limited to 2 or 3 months, but it's not it's not uncommon for these kids to be detained for long periods of time, particularly kids who have a viable claim for protection under US immigration law. But the biggest thing that I saw was a conflict of interest between the federal government, who on the one hand was becoming the legal guardian of these kids, who were all designated as unaccompanied alien children, making all the decisions about their placement, their transfer, and their release from custody on the one hand, and on the other hand, acting as a chief prosecutor and placing them in removal proceedings. So when they're designated as unaccompanied minors, on the one hand, they're put into mandatory detention, and on the other, into removal proceedings. So I saw that system as fundamentally flawed, but I think it was actually impossible to predict how much worse things have gotten. There has been an increased alignment with the operational mandates of the Office of Refugee Resettlement and this enforcement regime of the Trump administration. The legal protections that should apply to these kids while in custody, that is the humane treatment, educational services, recreation, and prompt release from custody, effective legal screenings, access to reproductive services, they're all increasingly compromised or set aside. And the entire system of federal regulations codified in the Flores Settlement Agreement that allows them to be released from detention to qualified sponsors is viewed by the Trump administration as the epitome of catch and release. And the thing that's particularly pernicious, these enforcement policies and these amended rules and regulations are almost always justified with a kind of Orwellian language of protection that disguises the true goals, which are enforcement. What the system intends to do is to prevent all illegal entries, and would love to do is deport most of these kids as opposed to releasing them to qualified sponsors, most of whom are their families. So I just want to take a few more minutes to just outline very quickly some of the ways in which these protections have been undermined by the Trump administration imposing new regs on the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Well, first of all, they've attempted to eliminate the Flores Settlement Agreement. In fact, that was listed in the Federal Register 1 year ago, August. That elimination has been halted by court action, but that's concerning in and of itself. They have appointed directors of the Office of Refugee Resettlement who have no experience with refugee populations and are coming from corporate or very conservative political backgrounds. They're political appointees. And the most brazen attempt was recently an unsuccessful move to give ICE officials positions within the administrative offices of the Office of Refugee Resettlement in Washington. And there are so many ways in which immigration judges, as Nicole so beautifully explained, have no judicial independence, work within the Department of Justice. But in September of 2017, the Department of Justice gave immigration judges the authority to strip children of that unique unaccompanied minor designation and the few protections they do enjoy. And that ruling was enforced by a higher level within the immigration court system, which gave it additional force. The directors of ORR have placed increased attention on presumed gang threat that the unaccompanied minors are said to represent. And this has resulted in more recourse to the secure detention. Remember, I said the top level of that system were juvenile jails. More kids are being placed in those jails that are juvenile prisons. And there's enhanced scrutiny before they're released on the mere suspicion of gang affiliation or criminal and delinquent activity. And as Nicole pointed out in a DHS memo in 2017, they're prosecuting family sponsors as human smugglers. And there was a memo of agreement in 2018 that in fact directed ORR to share critical information on potential sponsors, most of whom are undocumented. So under that memo of agreement, ORR must provide DHS with the names, the dates of birth, the address, the fingerprints of all the adult sponsors. This was supposedly meant to make the vetting of potential sponsors more secure, but the real goal was to undermine the system of sponsorship itself, to keep kids in detention longer, and most importantly, to identify and pick up undocumented family members who are coming forward as sponsors. And finally, I could go on and on and on. The zero tolerance policy of 2018, which resulted in the separation of parents from children to the tune of approximately 5,000, because it initiated criminal prosecution of all individuals over 18 and required that they be detained while awaiting the outcome of their immigration cases. And that meant, because federal prisons cannot have underage children, that they had to be removed and effectively turned into unaccompanied minors as a result of the separation policy. So expanded detention facilities has been the result. And another, actually there are more and more things, but speaking of the protections that do exist in immigration law for kids under 18, one of the only ones has been the special immigrant juvenile visa, which is a humanitarian visa subject to quotas based on the country of origin. That has been one way for these young people to get protection on the basis of their abuse, abandonment, or neglect by one or both of their parents, to stay in this country because it is in their best interest to do so, and most importantly, to get legal permanent status and ultimately become US citizens. Well, that whole process has been made much more difficult, the Trump administration, by reshaping USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services, that has placed many more additional requirements for the state orders that have to precede any ruling. And this supposedly was to ferret out fraud and certify abuse as genuine, but it's, you know, it's yet another attempt to make protection increasingly unavailable. And you just want to end with, like Nicole did, what's happening is that our nation is making war on a population of very vulnerable people, both adults and children, who are routinely denied their constitutional right to humane treatment and protections while in detention. And the irony is that the coronavirus pandemic has achieved what the administration has been trying to do all along, which is effectively end American compliance with domestic and international law to allow people fleeing persecution to make legal claims. And at the same time, this backlogged and chaotic proceedings in immigration courts have become deportation machines. And what we should be doing is monitoring asylum seekers, admittedly, but through non-custodial forms, not detaining them. We should allow them to wait in safety in the United States instead of dumping them in Mexico. We should reverse the current bars on asylum for people who flee domestic or gang violence. And we should enable law-abiding residents who came here as children to qualify for legal status. We need a return to the rule of law and justice in immigration policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. I think that ending gave us so many important details for us to potentially even discuss more in the Q&A, but it was so complimentary also to Nicole's speech as well. So thank you. So now we move on to the Q&A. You can keep sending your questions to Jonas, but let's get the ball rolling on that. So our first question is for both Nicole and Susan. So regarding the immigration system, what is holding back change? Whom should we be holding accountable for this lack of reform?
Nicole, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start and then I'll hand it over to you. So who is responsible? I think that question has a lot of different answers depending on how you're looking at it. So you know, I could say that you know, the Republicans are responsible. They're the reason that we haven't had a comprehensive immigration reform in over 30 years. I could say that the Democrats are responsible because actually Bill Clinton was the president that signed a very terrible anti-immigrant law called IRA of all names in 1996, which expanded the grounds of criminal deportability, expanded immigrant detention, and really I think that was the moment in which the immigration system became part of the criminal justice system. That was passed by Democrats and it was signed by a Democratic president. You know, I think we can blame the American people, honestly, for one, not paying enough attention to this issue. For those folks who might be sympathetic and want to have a more just immigration system, I think it typically has not gotten a lot of attention. And I think we can blame the same racism and xenophobia that affects a lot of our public policy right now and has for decades and centuries. So, you know, it's hard to say. You know, one of the things that I think is going to be very difficult, you know, if we have the political willpower to actually change the system, which, you know, I'm not sure if we're going to have that, but assuming we do, I think there is going to be a lot of institutional pushback from the immigration agencies themselves. So, you know, one thing about DACA, which is the program that Obama put into place so that undocumented youth could stay and work and go to school, one reason that Obama put that program into place, and he did it in a very public and kind of all-encompassing way, is because he had previously tried to get, you know, the immigration system to exercise prosecutorial discretion on an individual basis in a less public and kind of formal way. And there was a lot of institutional pushback from folks within DHS who just simply did not want to adopt that policy. So it had to come kind of top down, and it had to be in like a formal policy because the sort of more informal policy wasn't working. And I think and whatever elements within DHS which have been sort of kind of resistant to anything but the most draconian policies, those elements in the last 4 years have just grown, and a lot of folks in DHS who might have been more sympathetic to pro-immigrant policies have left, right? There's been attrition, and a lot of the good folks have left. And so, and they've hired a lot of new people who've been indoctrinated into this culture that is, like Susan said, they see themselves as a deportation machine, and that's what they see their goal as. They don't see their goal as adjudicating things fairly or trying to figure out who should be deported and who should stay. They really do see their role as deporting as many people as possible. And so even if we got the political, you know, apparatus to make this a focus and to prioritize immigration reform, I think you're going to really have to seriously think about how you restructure, I'm not going to say abolish, but restructure the immigration system to try to get around the institutional intransience that we've encountered in the past when we've tried such things.
Yeah, you know, as a sort of an aging hippie, I really believe in the power of protest and the power of the street. And I agree with Nicole. There is such institutional inertia, and agencies like enforcement-focused agencies like ICE and CBP have very powerful unions and will continue to push back. But one example that was hopeful for me in the context of the public outcry when we saw images and heard voice recordings of the kids who were in cages in CBP custody crying, and we saw that iconic image on the front page of the New York Times of a little girl in a pink outfit crying as she was being separated from her mother. Those kinds of things have an impact, and it was the public outcry that, you know, convinced even this president, not this president, but no doubt his political advisors, to issue the executive order in late June of 2018 that effectively ended family separation. Of course, it didn't. It has continued in many different forms. But I think the power of the voting booth, the power, I mean, if we can produce majorities in both houses of Congress, we have the beginning of thinking about steps we can take to restructure. It's not going to be abolished. Defunding the police is a pipe dream. And I think we have to be realistic in our goals. And one thing that I was thinking of, I've recently watched that horrifying documentary, Immigration Nation. And what you see when you hear differently positioned officials in the system, it's like an industrial factory. People who are working on the ground level understand only their particular piece of it. Very few of them have an understanding of the overall system. And similarly, people at the top, and one of the most powerful examples of that is Kristen Nielsen, when she was being interviewed at the height of this controversy, you know, just declared herself offended because she didn't see that, because she refused to acknowledge that there was a policy of separating children. There was a policy of zero tolerance. So from the top down, there's a lack of recognition of what the effects on the ground are, and people who are differently positioned on the ground can justify what they're doing as following a law, enforcing, you know, the rules. Like one guy said, I didn't give the decision to deport this person. I'm only following what's been given to me as a directive. And it's like Hannah Arendt's The Banality of Evil. So you have to think about the way these complex centralized bureaucracies are structured. And that's a daunting task. But I think if you get more enlightened leadership and you can break the power of some of these unions, you can make a start, but mostly it's voting, in my view. We came very close to comprehensive immigration reform in 2013, except there was a Republican majority in the House of Representatives, and John Boehner refused, because of the arcane rules, refused to bring the piece of legislation that had passed the Senate to the House floor. So I think there are some hopeful things that we can work on.
Okay. Thank you for that first question. You've already answered a bit. Both Susan and Nicole have answered a bit of this second question, but I think we can talk a bit more about it. And it is, what did the immigration deportation system look like prior to the establishment of DHS in 2002? And is that a system that we should aspire to return to? I think I know what those answers will be, but or was it similarly flawed, racist, and unjust?
Go ahead, Nicole.
I mean, it was flawed, racist, and unjust. That, and I mean, it's not like everything was great and September 11th happened, DHS was created, and everything went to hell. I mean, I think the creation of DHS just continued a trend which had been happening for decades, which was that a system which, you know, when you look in the kind of late 19th century, it was a, you know, there wasn't much of a system. I mean, you know, we didn't even have any immigration control until the very end of the 19th century, and for much of the early part of the, you know, the 20th century, it also was sort of still being formed. and the system has, it has evolved over the years into a system that is complex, convoluted, that most individuals can't understand how it works. And yet, I think prior to 2002, there definitely was a change that came with September 11th and in 2002. And I think part of that was that the restructuring of the immigration system under the kind of Homeland Security banner really changed how even parts of the immigration system that had been kind of service-oriented, it changed how those parts of the immigration system operated too, and it's actually continued to change. So just to give you an example, there's ICE, which everyone is familiar with, that arrests and deports people. There's Border Patrol, which everyone's familiar with. There's also a third agency within DHS called USCIS, and that's the part of the immigration system that processes applications for relief and for immigration status. So, if you want to bring your mother over, or your brother, or your wife, or someone from another country, you go to USCIS. And there's a lot of other kinds of applications that you can file as well. And typically that agency was, viewed itself as being like a service-oriented agency. Its mission statement, which I don't have in front of me, so I can't quote it, but it was something like, we are here to serve everyone in this country and to celebrate the diversity of the United States. It was a very kind of open and inclusive statement. Now, that agency used to be in the Department of Justice. It got folded into DHS, and slowly over time, that mission of service and inclusion has been chipped away, and that process has accelerated during the Trump era. And now you could almost see the USCIS as being kind of just another arm of the enforcement system. And in fact, they just recently, in the last year or two, changed their mission statement. It no longer talks about diversity and inclusion. It now says that their mission is to protect the homeland and the national and the security of the American people. So it's sort of become part of the enforcement system. And so I think, and I think the reason for that is when you take all of these functions and you frame them as an issue that relates to homeland security or national security, it becomes infected with that framework, with that lens. And then it's very hard to kind of avoid it becoming just kind of another enforcement system. So yes, it was unjust, it was unfair, it never worked very well. It works even less well now, and it's gotten even worse. And that is a turning point, but I don't think DHS, the creation of DHS is the reason that all of these problems exist.
Yeah, I agree. But I think if you take a longer historical lens, going back to the very beginning of our immigration nation, there have been repressive pieces of legislation that have really framed the way we've understood and treated immigrants. The Alien and Sedition Act at the end of the 18th century, and moving forward to the sort of the formulation of racist policies directed against Asians, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And, the act that in 1925 that sort of set the parameters for the modern immigration system was, basically establishing quotas based on, without saying them, race and national origin, and then set the tone for the kinds of immigrants that we found we were willing to welcome. So, but there have been periods of amnesty when, large swaths of undocumented people have been regularized. So I'm not, and I agree, things have become, in anthropology, we know how important rhetorics and labels are, and Homeland Security did set the frame. But I think that was a huge mistake, bringing together all of the enforcement agencies together under one umbrella. And going back to the immigration court system itself, it needs to be moved out of the Department of Justice and made an independent entity. Immigration judges have very little discretion. They don't have contempt authority. I had done research on juvenile delinquency in France. And the first time I sat in an immigration court, I thought I was back in France, where they have it's only a quasi-adversarial system and much more like an inquisitorial system, where judges in the state are very tightly aligned in their defense of the public interest. So there are many things that have to happen. I mean, the irony is that until recently, immigration judges weren't even called judges. They were, there was another term, maybe Nicole can think of it. They were sort of like, what were they? I can't remember, but they weren't judges. So the addition of robes and the accoutrements of judicial practice are fairly recent. And that's, to me, one of the most difficult, egregious sort of pitfalls of the entire system are people who really don't have the power to adjudicate cases fairly or have the independence to do so. So, yeah.
Okay, now to the third question. To what extent do the issues discussed here have economic roots, such as demand by American businesses for highly exploitable low-wage labor and poor economic conditions just in other countries? And how should those economic problems be addressed?
Susan, I can talk on this, but.
Go ahead, and I'll follow you.
Yeah, so I mean, there are both push and pull factors for why people come to the United States. In terms of push factors, yes, obviously some people are coming to the U.S. For, they're economic migrants, and they are coming because they do not have economic opportunity in their home countries. We could have an entire discussion on the U.S. Participation and involvement in Latin America and why those countries are the way they are, but that, we don't have time for that. That could be a whole other roundtable. So certainly some people are coming for economic opportunity. Many people, at least nowadays, are coming, they're being pushed from Central America because of violence and widespread persecution. If you look at the numbers, actually, in the early 2000s, most people crossing the southern border were from Mexico, and they were, for the most part, economic migrants. And after the 2008 economic crash, economic migration from Mexico slowed and didn't stop entirely, but there were more Mexicans leaving the United States than coming. And you can see then the numbers of Central Americans coming and seeking asylum started to climb and have continued to climb and to fairly high levels now. So the people who are coming are, have changed over time. But even the Central Americans who are coming because they're fleeing violence, also are coming because of economic reasons. People don't just have one reason. Like our law kind of assumes that either you're an asylum seeker or you're an economic migrant, but that's really not how it works. And so, asylum seekers are also trying to, create a better life for their families by gaining economic opportunity in the United States. So those are the push factors. The pull factors are there as well. I mean, we have many industries in the United States that are they're almost entirely dependent on migrant labor. There are a few guest worker programs that allow workers to come for short periods of time, but there aren't enough of those workers. There aren't enough of those visas. If you look at the agricultural industry, a majority of workers in the agricultural industry are undocumented, and many of the others are on temporary work visas. And so it's clear that the American economy needs these workers, and that's why they're coming, because if they can get jobs and their undocumented status, if they can manage to cross the border, it doesn't actually hinder them from getting jobs. And so, then the question is, if the American economy needs these workers in order to function, why have we, criminalized it and made it illegal, and made it so that the workers that are here who are undocumented have to live in the shadows, do not have very many rights, and the cynical side of me says that suits everyone just fine, because businesses who can pay people under the table, they can pay them less. They don't have to treat them well. They don't have to give them benefits. If anyone complains, you can turn them over. You can call ICE. You can threaten to call ICE. I mean, it gives employers a lot of power. And while there are laws on the books, that conceivably penalize employers for violating the law, very few employers ever see any sorts of consequences for it. There's a few dozen a year that are fined, but people rarely go to prison or something like that for it. And the people that really suffer are the undocumented workers themselves, who when ICE raids a plant, or a farm, the workers get deported and the employer is told to do better next time or gets a slap on the wrist, and then there are new workers there the next season. So, I think economics definitely plays a large role in migration patterns, and I think the reason that we've allowed this kind of dysfunctional system to develop is because it benefits the people in power.
I agree completely. I mean, the other thing that I'd like to say, given the decline in Mexican migration and the increase, the push factors from Central America, one of the things that we don't like to acknowledge is that, we've created the gang problems through our, the export of our harsh policing and the deportation of gang members who have reconstituted themselves in Central American countries and are such a scourge on the local populations there. But in the 1980s and 90s, we endorsed, in fact, push many of the Central American countries to enact structural adjustment regimes that created much more privatization, undercut small businesses, led to the proliferation of small exploitative maquila factories that that operate on very exploitive conditions, wages that aren't livable. So that creates a demand for, not enough employment for young people, who then turn to gangs, often as a way to survive, as a means to generate money, however illicit. And it's a cycle that has reinforced itself, in addition to environmental devastation in Central America, which has made it even more difficult in rural areas for farmers to get viable crops, feed their families, and to try and move from sustaining themselves to having to leave in order to put food on the table. And many of the people that I worked with or have seen in immigration proceedings have in fact are dependent on the migrant who goes to the United States, sends the remittances back. It's the only way that many of those people can survive in any way, shape, or form, is to have someone in the United States who's working. And as Nicole said, that system of employing undocumented workers in very dangerous industries like meatpacking is a way of controlling. It's just another really egregious form of social and economic control, and it depresses wages. It makes it impossible for those people to complain, to seek relief, from conditions, and not only in the factories or the workplaces, but also because they're so afraid reporting domestic violence or criminal activity in their own neighborhoods. It reinforces a cycle of vulnerability and economic fragility in the long term. When people can't get driver's licenses or drive without them because they have to get to work, that's a function of the way the system can just continues to marginalize people. So economics is very much a part of it. And just one other thing, and you know, in the research that I did with the youth, there was never one reason. I mean, we love to, the Trump administration and conservatives love to say that they're all coming here to game the immigration system because they're economic migrants. In almost every instance, particularly, or even in cases where there was, you know, egregious domestic violence at home, these young people came, yes, to avoid that, yes, to avoid gangs in the streets, recruitment by gangs, but also because they wanted economic opportunity. They wanted educational opportunity. They wanted a chance, as so many of them said to me, to be someone. So it's very complicated. And you know, the other irony is I find some of the most conservative legislators in the Congress today are the ones from areas that depend the most on undocumented workers. It's very ironic and intensely hypocritical.
We have many questions left and only around 15 minutes for the presentation or the panel, but I'm going to try to get through most of them. So this next one applies to many. I'm going to combine a few questions, but what role do educational institutions like public schools or universities hold in complying or prolonging predatory migrant policing? And then that expands to how can we hold big corporations that profit from the immigration system accountable?
Well, I'll start with the educational institutions. We have a constitutional protection in this country that guarantees that anyone, regardless of legal status, has access to public education. One of the things that I saw happening when I was doing research on the ground in the different federal facilities in many different states, Texas, California, the state of Washington, Florida, et cetera, was that local school authorities in some instances tried to refuse the registration of undocumented children. And activists, social workers, et cetera, had to accompany them and remind them, holding up, you know, the constitutional protection that allows them and requires them to go to public school. That's an incredibly important protection. And of course, for kids who, some of whom don't even know they're undocumented until they get to the end of high school and are thinking about going on to higher education, and then the realization crashes in on them. I had a number of undocumented students at Georgetown, and Georgetown had a very enlightened policies. To this day, they still do not publish the numbers of kids who are undocumented who end up at the university because of their talents and their academic records. And they also, to the extent that it's possible, give them financial aid. They're not eligible for federal funds, but welcome those kids. There is a position that was created at Georgetown, the Undocumented Student Coordinator, which is an incredibly important institutional statement on how valuable it is to ensure diversity. But even with all of that support, these kids couldn't work until some of them began to get DACA and had work authorization. They couldn't work at the work-study jobs that are part of the financial aid package. And some of them, before things were ironed out with DACA, in a closed meeting that we had with the deans, shared that they weren't eating on the weekends because their meal plans, I mean, this was the way in which bureaucracy regulations don't foresee the unique situations of vulnerable people. They were only covered for 4 or 5 days. They couldn't buy books. They had difficulty, you know, meeting their expenses. So providing educational opportunities is incredibly important. And of course, you know, voting the DREAM Act and giving these young people protections, legal permanent status, and the access to citizenship is really important. But there has to be a recognition too that even when educational institutions, whether they're public, secondary, or higher education, have to be aware of the unique challenges that these kids come with. Many of them are highly intelligent and extremely motivated, but may not have the same backgrounds and feel, even with all of these protections, humiliated, stigmatized by their undocumented status. So having institutional supports and public education, wider community education programs are really important to ensuring their success as they move through a system that remains hugely repressive.
Let's go on to the next question. I think that that was an excellent answer, and I want to make sure we get to all the other questions.
Yeah, I'm gonna go through some of. I wanted to ask, how does gender figure into this criminal justice and immigration system? What specific challenges do women face in these systems?
I can answer. I apologize. I'm having a problem with my video camera, so I'm just going to be on sound right now. So I guess there are many different facets of that question. I'll focus on one, which I think Susan raised earlier, but I think is really important, which is in our asylum system and how gender issues are considered in our asylum system. So in order to be eligible for asylum, you have to meet certain criteria. And one of them is that you can't just be afraid of generalized violence. You have to have you have to be basically persecuted on account of a protected ground. And there are 5 protected grounds. There is nationality, race, religion, political opinion. Those are all fairly well defined. And then we have one called membership in a particular social group. And that's a category that over the years has really, it started out being kind of ill-defined, and courts over the years have defined what exactly that means. And so for many women who are fleeing persecution and who are coming to the United States to seek asylum, many of their claims are gender-related or gender-based. So domestic violence claims are very common. So women are fleeing partners who they fear and who have hurt them, and they're worried are going to hurt them again and their children. Oftentimes the gangs in Central America are targeting women in particular, either to be gang girlfriends or to provide other services for gang members. And they're being targeted because they're women, because they're seen as vulnerable. Now, historically, being a woman was not seen as a particular social group. That the immigration system saw that as too broad. But if you actually look at the definition of a particular social group, it seems clear to me, at least, that being a woman should be, the group of women should be a particular social group. So the 3 requirements for being a particular social group are that the group is socially distinct in the society, so society recognizes them as a group, that it's particular, which means you can generally tell who's in the group, and who's outside of the group. And I'm now blanking on the 3rd requirement. What is the 3rd requirement? Anyway, so I mean, we can basically look at that definition, and we all know that women are distinct in the society in question. Gender is one of the first things we find out about babies before they're even born, right? We give people names based on gender. We divide people into gender all the time. And yet courts have typically not considered gender to be a particular social group. And the reason was essentially that courts did not want to make half of the world population eligible for asylum, because it turns out that women are persecuted everywhere, right? We live in a patriarchal world. Women are persecuted everywhere, and courts saw it as a political problem. They didn't want all women who are persecuted in their home countries to have the right to come to the United States and seek asylum. And so you have an asylum system where the kinds of claims that male asylum seekers are more likely to have are recognized, and a system in which the claims that women are more likely to have are not recognized. Now, at some point, I think in 2014, during the Obama administration, there was a court decision that held that there was that women who are unable to leave their partners, which was kind of a weird way of limiting it, so it wasn't all women, could be a member of a particular social group, and that opened up the possibility that domestic violence survivors could potentially qualify for asylum. But one of the first things that Jeff Sessions did when he became Attorney General was went about overturning that decision and basically saying, look, domestic violence is a private issue. It's not something that concerns us. So, you know, it's basically said it's terrible, but it's between two individuals, and the legal system has nothing to do with it, and overturned that precedent. Now, anybody who's studied the politics of domestic violence will tell you that domestic violence is not just a personal dispute between two people. That's, you know, it's a system that women are mostly subjected to, and they're subjected to it because they're women. But, you know, that kind of cut off that avenue for asylum. So while the immigration system itself, I think it's much more racial than it is gender-based. In general, there are areas where women in particular, I think, have a much harder time when they navigate the immigration system than men.
I'd like to just add, I'm working now on a book based on in-depth interviews I've done, excuse me, with undocumented mothers who came to this country first to earn money, with all of them with the hope of bringing their children over and having them live in this country. And of course, those hopes were almost immediately dashed because they had very inadequate jobs. They didn't make enough. They were working 2 or 3 jobs. But the thing that was interesting was all of these women had experienced horrific domestic violence at home. The other interesting thing about, I mean, it's a random sort of characteristic of the group of women who just agreed to talk to me, only one of them had ever been detained. So it opens a window on a particular kind of experience, but most of these women had been separated from their children for between 5 and 12, 13 years. So they've been separated long periods of time. And what I saw in listening to them and in talking to attorneys and others is that, you know, as mothers, as women, they were criticized every which way. They were bad mothers because they left, even though they left in many cases to provide economic, the means for their families to survive and have food on the table. They were bad mothers because they waited so long to bring their children over, regardless of the fact that they couldn't afford to do so beforehand. Or they were bad women because once they were here, they, you know, started new families and, you know, put distance between themselves and their abusive partners. So they have an uphill battle, regardless of the fact that now domestic violence, since the 2014 decision of Sessions that was reaffirmed by the Board of Immigration Appeals, now that cannot serve as a means of asylum. Some of these women now have US citizen children, and they have very peculiar ideas about what can happen if their kids become US citizens, or if their kids got the SIJ visa that I talked about, because it does not allow any child who receives that protection to then sponsor members of their family for legal permanent status. So I find that very troubling, and it's a way in which, you know, women who against all odds undertook an incredibly dangerous journey, some of whom were raped and terrorized on the way here, managed to get here and managed to put together some modicum of life and means of sustenance, and then are marginalized and criticized, you know, not only from, you know, people here who see them as, you know, gaming of the system, but also by the families often they left behind, including their own mothers, the partners whom they separated from, etc. So very complicated.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question, squeeze in that last one. I'm so sorry if I had to skip any question that was submitted to us. But this last question, I think, connects really well to our panel for in 2 weeks. about not immigration, about voting rights and policing. So this is a question about race, and it's something that Nicole already started prepping us for, but the question is, I'm curious as to the treatment of white or white appearing immigrants caught in the system. Surely there are Europeans who also overstay visas or enter illegally. Do they receive preferential treatment? That is, how much of the system is outright racist as opposed to a more general over rigid interpretation of immigration law?
Nicole, I think it's got your name on it.
Yeah. Yeah. So Susan mentioned the kind of sordid racial history of the latter half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. And she's absolutely right. There were explicit racial quotas. The Chinese exclusion laws banned, people from certain ethnicities from coming to the United States. And those laws are, for the most part, don't exist anymore. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 was really an attempt, and it happened during the Civil Rights era, to get rid of the racial quotas. Now, we could talk about how there are some facially neutral aspects of the immigration system, which end up having a disparate effect on certain racial groups, but it certainly improved the system. So if you have a person going through the immigration system today who is white, for the most part, they are subject to the same laws as everybody else. So, but the way that they experience the system is likely to be very different, because the immigration system is very much based on discretion of individuals. So there's the discretion of the ICE officer who decides to arrest you or not. There's the discretion of the immigration judge who decides whether to detain you or not. There's the discretion of a USCIS officer who decides whether to rubber stamp your application or whether to give you the third degree. And at every step, every time you have a decision maker in the system, assuming that they have racial biases, as we all do, right? You're going to, at the end of the day, because there are so many different steps in the system and it compounds the problem, when you get to the end of the system, you have a disproportionate impact on Black and brown immigrants as opposed to white immigrants. So I just want to tell a personal story. I mean, this is a rather silly anecdote, but I think it sort of illustrates the point. Which is that, so my husband is not a US citizen. I applied for a green card for him. He is white. And I'm an immigration lawyer, so I do green card interviews with people all the time, and I know what it takes to pass those interviews, right? I'm like prepping couples on the color of each other's toothbrushes, and every single date, when was your aunt born? I mean, we're like using flashcards and stuff, because I know that when they get in that room with the officer, that officer is going to be suspicious that it's a green card marriage and that they're going to have to prove that they're actually married. And so when I was, prepping for my own husband's green card interview, I made us prepare that way because I was terrified of going into this interview and having something happen. So we had a stack of evidence, like, a story high, and we had millions of pictures of us all in like careful little envelopes, and we quizzed each other on family trivia and all that stuff. And he thought I was being ridiculous, but I was like, no, this is how the system works. So we got into the interview and we didn't get a single question. He just stamped our papers and said, have a good day. And and my husband was like, well, do you want to see a photo? Because I've got this whole photo album that we put together to prove that our marriage is bona fide. And he was like, why? I already told you I believe you, and I'm just going to grant this application. Sort of irritated that we were thinking it was going to be more than it was. And, obviously, I don't know whether it was because of our race or our class or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of things that go into that, but to me, it just illustrated that I thought we were going to encounter the immigration system that my clients encounter. And in fact, I encountered the immigration system that people like me encounter, and that's a totally different system because it's individuals making the decisions.
Susan, do you have anything?
No, I think I don't. And I actually do have to go very soon. Sorry.
Perfect. No, so I think that is the end of this panel. Thank you so much for staying. I know we ran a little late and we couldn't do breakout rooms, but please, we want to thank Susan and Nicole. Those are two amazing presentations. And thank you so much for putting in the time and the commitment.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing it. And thank you to Nicole as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
So last thing is we have our last panel for this Transformative Justice Roundtable in 2 weeks. So please be on the lookout for that email and that RSVP. Thank you.
Alrighty, bye-bye now. Thanks.
Thank you.